الناس ما بترحمش وكأن اللي حصل ما حصل، وكأن الثورة دي ماتش واللي هيكسب يبقى بطل. الناس ما بترحمش وكأن اللي حصل ما حصل، وكأن الثورة دي ماتش واللي هيكسب يبقى بطل. ولا فاكرين اللي ماتوا وهم بيحلموا بالتغيير، ولا طايقين اللي عاشوا وكملوا مشوار التحرير. شافوا
Thank you very much, Hisham. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everyone for coming. Let me start by giving you an idea of what I would like to share today. As Hisham mentioned, it's part of ideas which I'm trying to develop to write a book on a question which seems to me relevant. Basically, it's a question of how can we understand political behavior, preferences of Egyptian liberals. The question became once again relevant in the aftermath of July 3rd, 2013, where the majority of liberal civil society actors, as well as political parties and politicians, decided to side with the military establishment in taking over power, in basically freezing political dynamics, freezing pluralist dynamics which were emerging in 2011 and 2012. I'm not suggesting that the pluralist dynamics we had between 2011 and 2013 were in any manner unproblematic. They were problematic, but they were signs of truly pluralist contestation which was unfolding in the country. So one of the main reasons for me to go back and decide to revisit the question of Egyptian liberals, their political behavior and preferences, and of course their relationship to the state and state ruling elites, has been their behavior since 2013. The decision to side with the military establishment, the decision to accept wide-scale human rights abuses and violations which followed July 3rd, 2013, including the mass killing of around 1,000 Egyptians, a bit less, as the security forces disbanded deposed President Morsi sit-ins in Raba al-Nahda, 2 squares in Cairo, which came to be famous in media reporting as well. Liberal civil society activists, politicians, political party leaders, in fact, have supported as well the candidacy of the former defense minister, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, to the presidential elections 2014, and pushed forward notions and ideas which not only are undemocratically spirited, but which even to an extent are quite surprising when they come from Egyptian liberals. Notions of a hero in uniform, a military savior, national salvation by means of pushing out of public space not only citizens but organized interest representation, all the way from professional associations and trade unions to political parties. So there are different reasons. What I'm trying to share to start my talk is that there are different reasons to go back and revisit the liberal spectrum in Egypt to try to understand why they have been pushing forward undemocratic choices, undemocratic preferences in the last 2 years. Now let me take you back and start by taking you back to highlight some of the issues which are to my mind quite important to understand where Egyptian liberals come from. Number one, it's indeed very difficult in Egypt to define what we truly mean when we refer to the liberal spectrum. It's a highly confused space, confused in the sense of it's difficult to outline the differences between liberals and non-liberals. If we mean liberals in a European sense, it will become very difficult to outline the differences between liberals and leftists. And the differences are in relation to state perception, the perceptions of the social order, the perceptions of politics, the perception of citizens, and the role in politics or in public affairs in general. So it's historically, as well as when we look at the contemporary situation, it's difficult to differentiate between liberals and leftists in Egypt. You tend to see most of them grouped somewhere not far away from the ruling establishment, not critical of autocratic regimes, autocratic rulers. Secondly, it's very difficult and puzzling to define Egyptian liberals if we use any Western-based benchmarking. It's a different tradition which has been emerging in Egypt since the beginning of the 20th century. The first time the word as such, the concept as such was used, goes back to public debates in Egypt between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. We had some intellectuals, public figures. Some of them ran in parliamentary elections as well. Some of you will associate liberalism in Egypt with the name of Ahmed Lutfi Sayyid, a well-known intellectual who ran for office, for parliamentary office in the liberal phase between the end of the First World War and 1952. The first coup in Egypt. But if you use Western benchmarking to approach Egyptian liberals, you will not find most of what we find in the US and in European countries. You will not find them operating based on a conception of the state which is small or retreating. It's not a rule of law state which does not interfere in the economy. It's in fact a maximalist understanding of the state, which is called upon once and again to interfere, even by liberals, not only by leftists. It's a state which, in fact, is not only developmental, but it's a state which has an enlightened and modernizing role as well in most views put forward by liberals. So if you use Western benchmarking, the question becomes very legitimate: why should we call them liberal in the first place? Do they deserve a description, liberal in the first place? Thirdly, a third confusion which you get when you approach the question of Egyptian liberals is how to differentiate between liberals and secular politicians, public figures, and intellectuals in Egypt. Because if, for of course, for historical reasons, which we can discuss as well, one of the clearest intellectual and programmatic statements which generations of nominally Egyptian liberals have been making is in relation to religion and politics, an attempt to push forward a separation between religion and politics. That has been sustained since the 1920s, and they did not wither away from it. They did not compromise on it in the 1950s and 1960s or later in the 1970s. So maybe one of the clearest programmatic and intellectual statements coming from Egyptian liberals is a statement on the need to separate between religion and politics. So the question becomes, why not call them seculars, secular intellectuals and politicians and groups and so on and so forth? Are they liberal or are they secular? And if you use the description secular, some of the questions which I will be raising in my presentation on their political preferences and political behavior will become less of a problematic issue to explain, because secular groups do not have to have a democratic platform, do not have to have a conception of a retreating state or a small state or a rule of law state, do not have to call for empowering civil society. What they are out to get is a separation between religion and politics, which a military establishment can well do. And then, of course, you can inject how Egyptian quote-unquote liberals have been reading regional experiences. Turkey is a great important case, and other cases as well. So these are three initial questions which one has to struggle with when looking at the liberal spectrum in Egypt. how to differentiate liberal from otherwise, be it leftist or different shades of leftist ideas and platforms in Egypt, how to avoid using Western benchmarking, and how to get to some clarity with regard to liberal and secular, and the way the two terms, conceptions are confused in Egypt. Now, briefly, what I'm working on right now is I'm trying to go back to the initial discussions, and here are which began in the 1920s and 1930s, and so it's actually great to be in Stanford because you get to find whatever you are looking for. So I was able to read for the first time some of the less well-known texts which Ahmed Lutfi Sayyid and people, so Egypt experts among you will know the names Ahmed Lutfi Sayyid, Salama Musa, El-Mazni, and so a set of names which really dominated in the 1920s and 1930s and coined how the word liberal and the description or concept liberalism was being used. So I'm reading them, and I'm rereading Hourani on the liberal age, and so there's some very interesting stuff, which historical statements which help. Now, my initial response to the three questions is, well, one can differentiate between liberal Egyptians and leftist Egyptians using, not really focusing on the state conception, but focusing primarily on how they approach civil society. So the one real difference between liberal and leftist in Egypt is not related to the state conception by any meaningful or in any meaningful way. It's primarily related to how they approach civil society. So in different liberal statements, programmatic as well as intellectual statements, which date back to the 1920s and 1930s, an attempt was made to find and to establish a second infrastructure to promote their ideas, not via the relation to the state and state ruling elite, but primarily focusing on the civil society. This is the only way to explain why Egyptian liberals since the 1920s have been doing much, in fact, for putting forward, according to them, modern education curricula. So I was surprised to see someone like Ahmed Lutfi Sayyid, once again a famous name, investing in writing a great deal of his daily press writings focusing on the educational system, not tackling political debates, not tackling the big debate of religion and politics, which was back then in the 1920s and 1930s one of the key debates Egypt's public space was having. So their focus, they had an idea of empowering civil society. And their idea of civil society was a modernist idea. It was a modernist, non-religious based civil society as opposed to the existing structures which were, according to them, religious dominated. And they were not shying away back in the 1920s and 1930s from reaching out to professional associations, to attempting to organize even in the working class. One of to my mind, until I went back and reread some of the literature, one of the phenomena which I could not explain before was that the Wafd Party, a liberal party, which was established post the revolution of 1919, a national independence revolution, the Wafd Party had a very strong presence in the working class. And so I kept wondering why a party which was established with a liberal platform would be that keen on establishing strong presence in the working class and having that presence reflected in its programmatic statements. The Wafd Party put forward ideas on the land reform prior to 1952, prior to the coup of 1952, which was later under Nasser coming to implement different land reform policies. So a key issue to differentiate between liberal and non-liberals is to focus on civil society. Secondly, the confusion between Western benchmarking and non-Western benchmarking. I believe that Egyptian liberals were not, from the very beginning, and here they are not different from leftist groups, all shades of leftist groups. They did not, from the modern creation of the Egyptian state, these groups, the modern creation goes back to the 19th century. These groups became relevant in the 20th century. They were not looking at themselves as representing an opposition to the state, or as representing an intelligentsia critical of the state and its ruling establishment. No. In fact, they perceived the role as becoming state-sponsoring elites. And the idea was to replace traditional elites with modern, forward-looking, Western-educated, not shying away from raising questions on separating religion and politics, to replace traditional elites by liberal and leftist elites. They did not see in their groups, parties, movements, a power center parallel to the ruling establishment. No. They perceived the role as in accordance with the ruling establishment. And that was an interesting dynamic which was growing since the 1920s and 1930s, where a bit of inclusion did happen. In fact, in the liberal age, primarily of liberal groups, someone like Taha Hussein, a well-known writer, intellectual, became minister. Different politicians of liberal public figures of liberal orientation became politicians, were parliamentarians. There was a bit of inclusion which took place, especially in the liberal age. Later, leftists were coming to be included, some of them at least in the 1950s and 1960s. But from the beginning, the perception was not the perception of having a liberal spectrum or a leftist spectrum critical of the state, but working in alliance with the state. And here is the key component of perceiving the state as the only modernizing agent in society. Liberals took civil society seriously, but they continued to put their bet on the state, which was to push forward the modernizing developmental agenda in alliance with liberal and leftists, and no longer in alliance with religious institutions. It was a replacement of sorts which was being suggested, and therefore Western benchmarking does not help much. Also, in Western benchmarking on liberals, Egyptian liberals were interested in notions of rule of law. But once again, here the development of their ideas on how to get an independent judiciary, a stable system of rule of law, how to protect private property, how to enable citizens to equal citizenship rights without discrimination based on religion or whatever other conditions. These ideas, which were developing in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, were interrupted by the coup of 1952. And then liberals did not have, historically speaking, similar trajectories to Western liberals or liberal groups elsewhere. So, to an extent, I guess if we try to see what kind of benchmarking, what kind of benchmarks, what kind of historical legacies one should look at to understand where Egyptian liberals are coming from, one should really focus on how they perceived the state, its role, and their role as state-sponsoring, state-promoting, ruling establishment promoting elites, and not opposing elites. I really like to use the excellent German concept, staatstragend, which is it's more than state-sponsoring. It's building the fundamentals of the state on the role of these elites. Thirdly, on liberal and secular, that remains one of the issues which I'm trying to, as of now, to once again reread. Notions on separation between religion and politics have always been central to Egyptian liberals since the 1920s. Of course, different variations were put forward, adapting to the wider socioeconomic conditions, adapting to wider public debates. So I find it striking. Egyptian liberals throughout the last century, the 20th century, did not revisit their ideas on separation of religion and politics in any meaningful manner. They were against confusing religion and politics. They were very critical of the establishment of religious-based right-wing movements, the Muslim Brotherhood, and later on different movements which were emerging. They were, however, not critical of the state-sponsored, regime-sponsored use of religion in politics as well. So liberals did not were not relevant politically or in public debates in most of the 1950s and 1960s. Later, under late President Sadat, they were once again gaining some ground, and they did not develop a critical platform on Sadat's systematic use of religion as a legitimacy creating tool. Sadat used official religious establishments, Islamic religious establishment with its different components to generate legitimacy, and liberals, if we look at the Wafd Party, which was re-established in the 1970s, where different groups were not as critical as they used to be. Later on, there were different election-based alliances between liberal groups and Islamist or religious right-wing groups, between the Wafd and the Muslim Brotherhood, all the way to 2011 and 2012. So here too, on the issue of taking separation of religion and politics seriously, some discussion is warranted to understand where Egyptian liberals stand and how they have come to criticize religious-based groups, but not to be as critical of the state use or regime-sponsored use of religion in politics. So having these ideas in mind, now let me take you to. That's really what I'm working on right now, trying to qualify the debates and understand the genealogy of different key concepts, be it in relation to state conceptions, civil society, citizens, and so on and so forth. Now let me take you to today's situation and share some of the reflections I have on contemporary liberal discourses and what I call the undemocratic deceptions. Once again, it's very easy to say, well, if they were not democratic in the first place, why do we expect them not to side with the military? If they were not for a retreating small state, why do we expect them to act otherwise post 2013? And if they were not able to develop systematic ideas on the independent judiciary and rule of law, one should not be surprised looking at their current political behavior and preferences. However, I find it intriguing to look at how Egyptian liberals, and the reference is to primarily politicians organized in political parties. Some of them are old and some of them are new. And old and new, the reference, the timeline is to pre or post 2011. So you have a Wafd Party, which was back in action since the second half of the 1970s, or a party like the Free Egyptians Party established post 2011. The reference is to public figures, primarily who use the media landscape to communicate their ideas to wider segments of the Egyptian population. And the reference is to civil society organizations as well. Some of them are human rights organizations, and some are interested in charity work. But this is the spectrum which we are looking at: university professors, intellectuals, once again communicating primarily to the wider population using media, the press, televised media, and so on and so forth. I find it intriguing the way they have been legitimizing siding with the military. And here are the undemocratic deceptions or fallacies, which I would like to outline. It's part of discourse, an attempt to do a discourse analysis of contemporary liberal programmatic and intellectual statements. And to get the facts right, apart from a few number of liberal intellectuals who identify themselves as liberal, here I'm really using self-identification. Apart from a very limited number of liberal intellectuals, the spectrum in general sided with the military, and has been in fact silent with regard to human rights violations and abuses. And it's only very slowly that now some of the critical remarks are emerging. The five deceptions which have been systematically used to legitimize turning against pluralist dynamics and turning against beginning democratic dynamics in 2011-2012 are commonly used by Egyptian liberals, but you find them in leftist discourses as well, because once again, most leftist groups, old and new, have sided with the military establishment as well, which made Egypt look from afar as a place where actors in politics or state actors as well as non-state actors were driven by one key objective, which is to get Islamists out, to get an Islamist-free political arena or an Islamist-free political space. But it's a bit more than that. So the first deception which I'm referring to is the deception of the state as not only a modernizing agent, but as the one actor which is able in Egypt to define what politics is all about, to set an arena, to set the framework for political interactions, and to set the rules of the game. And so listening and reading what liberals have been writing in the last 2 years, you clearly see an attempt to say, well, it's upon the state to define how politics should be practiced, how political interactions should look like. So that idea of the state as the sole actor to define the framework, the arena of political interaction, and to set the rules of the game was key in pushing forward arguments to justify the military intervention. So if the state is supposed to do it, now of course the state in general cannot do it. You have to resort to the key powerful institution in the state, which is the military. And in some variations, you will find the military security complex, sort of saying, well, they are the two institutions or entities which can define what politics is all about in Egypt. And that is a clear undemocratic deception, because once again it ignores history. It ignores the history of Egypt prior and after 1952, but definitely prior to 2011. It reduces the state to the military establishment and the security apparatus. It sidelines civil society, and it sidelines citizens in general. So if there's only the state which can define what politics is all about and set the rules of the game, not in contestation with civil society actors, the question becomes relevant. So why do we have political parties in the first place? Why do we have civil society organizations in the first place? What kind of legitimation do they have for their own parties and groups to exist if it should be left to the state? But then when you listen carefully, it's an idea of, once again, creating an Islamist free political arena by means of military intervention. So it's a deception, because it takes you in the direction of the state will figure it out and the state will sideline. In reality, it means arresting, jailing, killing Islamists, and getting an Islamist free political arena means a great deal of repression. And unprecedented repression has been seen in Egypt in the last 2 years. So, to my mind, this perception of the state as the sole actor has been central to liberal ideas. Secondly, the second deception or fallacy is the notion of national necessity, in Arabic al-darura al-wataniya, which, once again, I mean, it's not new. It has been used since the 1950s and 1960s, but not primarily by liberal groups. It's new that liberal groups are leaning heavily on ideas of national necessity to basically legitimate the military intervention in 2013, on July 3rd, 2013, and to legitimate the militarization of the presidency by getting the former defense minister to run for the presidential office, and in fact to legitimate as well human rights abuses and violations, because it's a national necessity to wage a war on terror and not to look at liberties and freedoms or human rights abuses or safeguards for an independent judiciary and so on and so forth. So that idea of national necessity has been in Egypt, in Egyptian intellectual debates, in fact, a place where primarily leftist groups and leftist intellectuals have worked very hard to legitimate undemocratic developments by referring to national necessities. The necessity in the 1950s and 1960s was a bit the liberation of Palestine, the Arab-Israeli wars, or social justice. The necessities of the 1970s were later on economic development, in the 1980s under Mubarak up until 2011, stability, and so these are different shades of how the argument on national necessity has been used. The troubling component is the national necessity has been increasingly used in the last 2 years by Egyptian liberals to legitimate freezing politics and moving beyond democratic dynamics, and to legitimate, in fact, the supremacy, the dominance of the military and security apparatus. And then you tend to see it reduced to uncritical support of the current president, once again embodying the national necessity as the savior, which is a very problematic idea. And it has that component of savior or hero in uniform, incarnating national necessity, a highly passive perception of what the population is all about, what politics is all about. So it gets reduced, the state and politics and public spaces get reduced to what the savior wishes to see or to do. And secondly, the idea of a nation in exceptional conditions, the idea of exceptionalism. I'm not sure of any country which was able to democratize or push forward pluralist dynamics with that perception of exceptionalism. Exceptionalism is always a legitimation for moving beyond safeguards of freedoms and liberties, for evacuating citizens out of public spaces, for imposing one opinion on citizens, and so on and so forth. And that is the second deception. The third deception, once again, analyzing contemporary liberal discourses, is the idea of the readiness to democracy. Once again, I guess any one of you who has been working on Egypt or in Arab countries will find different shades of this argument of, are we ready? The question, are we ready for democracy? Coming from state actors, coming from state representatives, but as well as from leftist and liberal politicians and public figures. And the fallacy here is basically it freezes the understanding of democracy as a process. So it really puts forward an idea, a panacea of sorts, an ideal place where we have to be there first before unleashing democratic dynamics. And it has many undemocratic elements, but primarily, once again, suspending the notion of democracy as a process which warrants experiments, which warrants a great deal of interaction between different groups. Number 4, once again, a notion of clear undemocratic connotations. The idea of evoking it's Egypt and the region. It's how the region and regional events are being used to legitimate the new autocracy in Egypt and to legitimate imposing the militarization of the state structures in general, and the militarization of the presidential office, but in fact, and freezing political dynamics, understood as pluralist dynamics, how the region is being used. So the reference is always to the tragic cases of Iraq and Syria, and Egypt should not be Iraq and Syria, and the only way for Egypt not to be Iraq and Syria is to let the military do. And once again, when it comes from state representatives, it's less alarming than when it comes from actors trying to be part of public debates and trying to be part of decision-making processes, but they use the region in a manner which is justifying autocracy, justifying human rights abuses and violations by evoking a sense of regional risks, regional tragedies, and Egypt and the Egyptian state and Egyptian society being kept intact, being saved by the military establishment. Once again, here is a highly selective perception of what the region is all about, but even more problematic is that you do not find any discussion among Egyptian liberals on how despotism in Iraq and Syria led to where Iraq and Syria stand as of now. So that is basically pushed out of the discussion. It's as if Iraq and Syria, their stories began with toppling down the dictator in Iraq and with the Syrian popular quest for freedom in 2011. Finally, and here I come to a set of ideas related to how liberals look at citizens and their role in politics. As I was part of the political scene in Egypt in 2011, 2012, and 13, I found some statements coming from nominally liberal politicians, party members, intellectuals, alarming. So there was a statement which was made right after the first constitutional referendum in March 2011, in which basically the popular vote went in the Islamist direction. And the Islamist direction back then was the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi groups. I'm not going to get you into the details of what the referendum was all about, but right after liberal and leftist movements or secular movements were defeated in the referendum of 2011, there were calls coming up from different public figures saying, well, maybe we should figure out how to introduce a two-class system in relation to voting. So how to make the vote of educated Egyptians more important than the vote of non-educated Egyptians. And I said, wait, I mean, it's too nonsensical for any public figure to put it forward. But they were serious. They kept, and in fact, as of today, you will find the same argument being pushed forward once and again. Every single time, and you know, Egyptians are not going to that fake process which is being termed elections. But as he used to go, every single time there were calls right after election results were announced by liberals to let's figure out a way of classifying the vote, of not simply of disenfranchising those who do not vote the way we would like them to vote. And then secondly, starting 2011 as well, there were different ideas put forward by liberals on the so-called supra-constitutional articles. And the idea was basically to freeze politics. These ideas came in circulation right after Islamists were beginning to win in every single election. So the referendum 2011, parliamentary elections 2011 and 12, presidential elections 2012, constitution referendum 2012. And so they were pushing forward ideas on, let's agree on a set of supra-constitutional principles which cannot be changed, not by parliaments, not by elected parliaments, nor by elected presidents. When you look at the details of these supra-constitutional articles, they were all, in fact, going in a Turkish direction prior to the democratization process in Turkey, basically getting the military establishment to be the ultimate referee of politics, enabling the military to basically systematically interfere in politics every single time Egyptians decide to vote, unlike what liberal and leftists are telling them to do. And so these ideas once again, were leading post-2013, right after the military interference in politics, into arguments in favor of we should leave it to the military establishment. It's the one establishment which can protect the state. And so what about citizens? And so if liberals decide to ignore civil society post-2013, to ignore political parties, to once again go to the state sponsoring, state promoting role, what happens to citizens? And here you see citizens being looked at by liberal intellectuals and politicians in four different manners, all of which are undemocratic. Number one, citizens as in deep need of awareness, education, to be able to participate in politics. Once again, a highly static conception of what democracy and citizens in democracies or in democratic transitions are all about. The idea of freeze, let's go back and make awareness campaigns, educate them right, and then get them in. Disenfranchise citizens until they get it right. Secondly, the idea of citizens as being, now voters, as being reduced by social and economic incentives. So liberals, in fact, and leftists, when they refer to Egyptian voters, they always refer to them in Arabic. So I'm doing a literal translation as voters, sugar and oil voters. The reference is to how voters, according to liberal groups, once again, get reduced to voters deciding on their political behavior, on their voting preferences based on social and economic conditions. Citizens are only welcomed to participate in politics or be part of the public space, according to liberals, if they decide to carry on the dehumanization of the other, and the other is the Islamist other as of now. And so if citizens say no to dehumanization, human rights violations and abuses, it's legitimate to imprison, it's legitimate to jail, and it's definitely legitimate to evacuate them out of the public space. And of course, when the evacuation materializes in a very low voter turnout of the parliamentary elections, less than 5%, then they get back at citizens and say, well, why didn't you come out and vote? But you disenfranchise them and you ask them to leave. You ask them not to be part of the debate. Finally, they look at citizens as, in fact, not in any manner as agents, individual agents, but they tend to group them in masses. So once again, not surprising when it comes from Nasirists in Egypt, but quite surprising when it comes from liberal groups and liberal public figures. They accept the creation of an imaginary collective entity called the masses, and the masses get pushed around according to regime preferences. So these are the five key, to my mind, key deceptions which have been systematically used in the last 2 years by Egyptian liberals to legitimate their support of the military intervention and the emergence of the new autocracy. Let me end on two notes. Number one, that does not mean that some of the nominally liberal parties, liberal agents in Egypt do not every now and then do not make some critical remarks on the savior and his policies, on the current administration and its policies. But when they do, it's not by any manner driven by democratic considerations, and it's not in any manner driven by a principled position. It's actually driven by the little revenues they are getting. I mean, they imagine that they will be getting more revenues, and they imagine that while getting a military administration will enable them to be the key component of politics. Creating an Islamist free political arena will mean that liberal and, to a lesser extent, leftists will be the dominant actor, but it's not. The military is doing it independently, as it has always done. So once again, I mean, they have a huge misreading of what Egyptian history is even all about. But you will sometimes, when you follow Egyptian debates, you will see some struggles, but it's not driven by democracy in any manner. Secondly, that does not mean that the liberal spectrum in Egypt does not have alternative voices or young generations which are trying to figure out ways of transcending that autocratic legacy of existing liberal elites. There are some very interesting groups which primarily operate in universities, which operate among informal networks, and they are pushing forward a healthy debate on military-civilian relations, a very interesting debate on religion and politics, a very interesting debate on the use of religion, be it from state-run state actors, because the current administration, in fact, uses religion increasingly, more and more, as a source of legitimacy in different ways. So I'm not saying that is what we will end up having, and I see a great potential for development within the liberal spectrum in Egypt. It's generational. These are young people, students, and young Egyptians working in informal networks, but they are pushing forward the right debates. It will take time to impact the wider public space. It's related to how strong the current autocratic grip will remain. How massive human rights abuses and violations are. At the end of the day, we have, according to some estimates, close to 35, anywhere between 35 and 40,000 Egyptians imprisoned. So these are all factors relevant, but the process is emerging, and it's not only political. The very dynamic scenes, intellectual scenes, cultural production, literary production, and this is all coming from young Egyptians trying to revive some of the ideas which brought them to the streets in 2011. Thank you very much.
اتضربوا رصاصة غدر في ماتش اتقتلت بيها أحلامنا وما فيش راجل فيكي يا بلد قال لأ بلاش أولادنا الناس ما بترحمش ولا تترحم على اللي حصل أولادنا كانوا في ماتش والموت ليهم وصل ده الناس ما بترحمش وكأن اللي حصل ما حصل وكأن الثورة دي ماتش واللي هيكسب يبقى